Hello and good evening. My personal choice tonight is Dr. Joseph Needham, Fellow of the Royal Society, Fellow of the British Academy. I don't know how you react to scientists, but sometimes, well, they scare me stiff. Dr. Strangelove, obsessed by bombs and rockets, long since ceased to be a mere comic creation. It is said that when Albert Einstein gazed on the first atomic explosion, he reflected on his life's work as a scientist and cried, "If I had known how it would end, I would have been a locksmith." Not all scientists share his sense of moral responsibility. However, my guest tonight is very much in that Einstein category. A scientist, a biochemist to be more precise, who believes wholeheartedly that the scientist has a responsibility to the world and to the people around him. I think I first heard of Dr. Needham when he returned to this country from the Far East to accuse the Americans of using germ warfare in Korea. It was not the kind of accusation to make Dr. Needham popular either with the press nor with the scientific and academic establishment. But nor, coming from a scientist of pronounced religious beliefs, was it an accusation that could be ignored. It is this mingling of the scientific mind with religion and a kind of non-Marxist English socialism that intrigues me about Dr. Needham. He has devoted the last years of his life to writing a massive history of Chinese science and civilization. The work is planned in 7 volumes. So far, Dr. Needham, who I hope will not mind me revealing is 76, has completed 5 volumes. He has taken time off from his labours to join me tonight. Dr. Needham, from my reading, I know that by the age of 10, you were immersed in such books as The History of Egypt and Schlegel's History of Philosophy. Am I to take it, therefore, that you were a precociously bright child?
Well, I don't know about that, really, but I was certainly an only one, and perhaps if you don't have brothers and sisters, you tend to immerse yourself in books. I dare say it might be the case with others. So this was the kind of environment I grew up in. My father, you see, was a physician in general practice at that time, and he had a very good library.
You were an only child. Were you also a lonely child?
Yes, certainly lonely. You always are. But there is another thing I'd like to throw in here, which might help our discussion, and that is that my father and my mother didn't get on. And I think this is really rather significant because I grew up in what I call a field of force, what the electricians would call a field of force, strung between 2 poles. And I think it may be that that was the reason why, for the whole of my life practically, I've had a sort of passion for what one might call bridge building. I think this might link up with what I know is in your mind for talking a little bit later, but I know first of all when I was a student, you see, it was a question of religion on the one hand and science on the other. And then later on, when I became a scientist, it was biochemistry on the one side and morphology on the other, because what is the relation between the atoms and molecules that make up our bodies and so on, and the form, the shape of the organs, the many different members and parts of the body, you see, how can these levels interact at all? So there was another bridge to be built. And then finally, when a new vocation, as it were, appeared on the scene, there was this question of building bridges between China and Europe, China and the West. I think it's really quite significant.
And all this, you feel, stem from being a bridge between your father and your mother?
Well, trying to be and failing.
You failed?
Well, I mean, I don't say failed, but in those days people didn't separate as easily as they do now. In those Edwardian days, they stuck together, even however much of a hell it was. And I think for a small boy to grow up in that, I mean, obviously loving both, and yet under the necessity of reconciling what was almost irreconcilable.
But your father was a very Edwardian figure, wasn't he? Was he difficult to get on with because of his class attitudes?
No, not at all. No, I was a great fan of his, really. I was much more enthusiastic about him than I was about my mother, because basically, although I looked like her, from the mental point of view, I was much more like him, much more scientifically minded.
Can you pick the moment when you became politically aware?
Now, it's very difficult, What I do remember most distinctly is upsetting my father in 1917 by saluting with great enthusiasm the Bolshevik Revolution. With my oldest friend, Frank Chambers, we upset him quite a lot because he was very conscious of what he called the lower orders and things like that, you know. And we thought it was a very good idea for the lower orders to have a chance to see what they could do. So it upset him quite a bit. and I have often puzzled as to where these ideas came from, and I suppose that H.G. Wells and Bernard Shaw were the only two, because I certainly hadn't read any Marx or any of the founding fathers of Marxism at that time, when I was 17.
That's what I was going to say to you. It always seemed to me, what I know of you, that your socialism has appeared to be a particularly English brand of socialism. Would that be fair?
I don't think it's yes. I don't think that's quite unfair. I know I've been tremendously inspired by the story of the Civil War in the 17th century, the Levellers, for example, and the Diggers, and Gerard Winstanley and John Lilburne and people like that. Later on, I made a special study for my own pleasure of the Civil War period, the 17th century.
So, also middle-class socialism?
Now, what would middle-class socialism be?
I'm not quite sure, but I wonder. I wonder whether it's a kind of socialism that stops short of revolution in its own country.
I don't think so. You see, we in England were regarded with the same sort of horror as the Bolsheviks were in 1649, because after all, we were the first to execute a king. It hadn't happened in Europe before, as far as I know. And the other countries in Europe looked very much askance at the English in consequence.
Did your father look with horror upon you at that time?
Oh, I don't remember what he thought about it. I don't think he took very much interest in the 17th century.
But at you, and your views of the
Oh, I wouldn't say horror, but he certainly didn't feel the same way about 1917 as I did.
At the same time, almost as you're discovering socialism, you're also quite heavily into religion, aren't you, in your life? And I'd have thought that here was one of what, to the outsider, certainly to myself, would appear as one of the contradictions in your life, that many of the early socialist thinkers prided themselves on their rational thought, on their being, in fact, anti-God, if you like, anti-Christ, and yet here you are, an early socialist and also deeply religious.
Well, contradictions is the kind of thing you have to build bridges between, isn't it? I mean, that brings out what we were saying a moment ago. But whether there's any contradiction between Christianity and socialism is a very moot point. I mean, after all, don't forget that there was a very, very strong Christian socialist movement in the 19th century. You only think of people like Charles Kingsley, and then, of course, later on Charles Marson and lots of East End vicars and things like that. It was quite a big movement in this country, and there were in other European countries too. The Marxists didn't like it, of course, because being based on Victorian materialism, they made anti-religion a kind of one of the keynotes of the platform. But that I never could go along with myself.
You can't go with Lenin and the opium of the people.
Well, yes and no, because I think it very often has been the opium of the people. I think throughout history, this has very often been the case. And I remember in 1972 in China, never feeling so strongly as I did then, talking with Chinese friends in the People's Republic. I never felt the force of that criticism so much. The idea that engaging in religious activities, in liturgical religion, or in the usual aspects of religion, made you positively. It was a positive influence, making you fail to see what had to be done here and now, while in this compounded body, as Gerard Winstanley or one of those people said, for other people, that it can be a blinding thing. On the other hand, if you met one of Cromwell's troopers with the new model army, for instance, and said to him that religion was the opium of the people, I think you would have, I don't know what, he'd have hit you over the head or something, because it was obviously entirely different. It was a great revolutionary force in our 17th century.
Do you not then feel it as a contradiction within you?
Well, history is full of contradictions. I mean, I'm not against...
How about yourself? Never mind history.
No, I don't feel any contradiction in myself, because I have really been a lifelong Christian socialist, and I'm quite proud of that. I don't think there's any contradiction. It depends how you interpret the Gospels, what it was all about, whether to what extent what you mean by the love of one's neighbour and things like that.
For a time after the First World War, you were in fact a lay brother in an Anglo-Catholic order. Did you actually contemplate becoming a monk?
Yes, I did for a time, as a young research student. This again, people say contradiction, all right. But as a young research student doing biochemistry, I was indeed a lay brother of the oratory. I was an oratorian lay brother. And then what changed that, I think, was the feeling that it gradually came over me that celibacy was not my vocation. So I got out while the going was good. And I married another biochemist.
Who, in fact, became a fellow of the Royal Society with you.
Yes, she is, yes.
It's important to you to have married a scientist, to have married somebody. Could you have built that bridge, or was that a necessary ready-made coupling, as it were?
That's a very interesting point. I often think about it now. She's in her 81st year now, and all this long time, there's never been really any strain. And I think it's something about a fundamental rationality in her.
It seemed at the time, going back to the time when you were a lay brother, and just after that, that you were in search of a purpose in life. Did you, in the end, in fact, find this purpose in science?
Oh yes, undoubtedly, for some 30 years or so. And I suppose one could say so still. I mean, I'm still a believer in science. I think it's done far more good to humanity than evil. It's done both. But it needs watching, as it were, and I feel that it's more and more important than ever now that society should control what you do with science. I mean, the discoveries, it really should be said that the discoveries that science and modern medicine are making are so earth-shaking, really, in their possibilities. I don't mean obvious things like the atomic bomb, but all sorts of things in fetal medicine and playing about with the genetic material and all that kind of thing. It's so tremendously important that society should control it, and that we shouldn't necessarily do all that we can do. I'm very fond of quoting a piece that I found in an 8th century Chinese book, the Guanyinzi book, where I think the chap was discussing the making of extremely sharp swords by pattern welding. And he said, only they who have the Tao will be able to perform such actions, and better still not perform them, though capable of performing them. And this, I think, should be an absolute motto for society in relation to science and medicine and technology in the future. We absolutely must control.
It's right that scientists should push all the way on, but it's also right that we should also control
what we do
with what they've discovered, you're saying.
I think so. I'm not against any moratorium on research or on the acquisition of knowledge, because I don't believe that any knowledge can be bad in itself. It can't be bad in itself. It must be good. But what we do with it, what human beings do with it in order to live the best possible lives available to them, that certainly needs a kind of control.